Good morning, my name's Rod Fleming and you may have met me in the past. Today's video is about cultural appropriation. This is a very important thing. It wasn't an important thing at all until very recently, but it has become one. So let me explain exactly what cultural appropriation appears to be, because there's no certain definition. It is the use of cultural motifs or lived experiences claimed by people of one culture or one cultural group by people of another, right? So the first cultural group is saying, no, you can't do that. No, you can't wear braids because that's part of my culture. I'm a Black American, that's Black American, which it isn't, but it's claimed by them. And so it has become an issue because so many people of a particular culture, that is Black American, have decided that cultural appropriation is a thing, which in no other case is it a thing. Normally human cultures just feed off each other all the time. It's an absolute constant that we take in things from, you know, in Britain the most popular dish is curry. Last I looked, that was Indian. And India, by the way, is not called India because of Indians, it's called India because of the Indus River, otherwise known as the Sindhu, just so you know. So, why has cultural appropriation become important? And the answer is that Black US Americans have no culture. Now that's not their fault, that's not an insult. They have no culture because it was taken from them. It was forcibly removed from them. When they were brought into the Americas, their existing black cultures were stripped away. They weren't allowed to express themselves in the way that they did when they were in Africa. And to a limited extent that has to do with climate and things like that, but mainly it was because they were slaves and their owners didn't want them to behave in ways that were African. And so what happened was that these blacks in the Americas began to adopt, particularly in the United States, not quite so much in South America, for example, Brazil, but particularly in the United States, they began to adopt European cultural motifs. And if you look at pictures, for example, of slaves, you know, in the slave era, they were dressed like Europeans. They didn't dress like Africans. They were dressed like Europeans because they were told they had to. And similarly, in terms of religion, they basically were not allowed to use their old African religions, so they adopted European religions. They became Baptists, mainly. Some became other denominations, but they basically became Christians, and baptism was the big one. Christianity is quintessentially a European religion. I mean, yes, it's been exported, it's all over the world, but nevertheless, it is a European religion created by the Romans with a white guy at the top. You know? So what happened was that for a very long time, hundreds of years, blacks in US America simply didn't have a culture that was really their own. In music, it's very interesting, because in music what happened was that they started to use instruments that were actually European and started to bring in some more typically African modes. And that's where you get the blues. The blues is not really an African music at all, but it is a US Black American culture. It was more than just a music, it's a culture. And it uses, you know, the very strong rhythm and the very simple harmonic structure that it has, the very simple melodic structure of the blues. It's all designed so that anybody can play the blues. So it's easy, you know, you can just get a blues thing going together and everybody will be able to sing it. You sing the line once, the rest of them will sing it back. It's easy. It doesn't mean it's not good, it's really good, but and in the hands of a master or a mistress, it is incredible, but not African. There's no way you can say that the blues is an African tradition. There's no blues in Africa at all. Until the mid-1960s, such things were largely underground. The blues was adopted as jazz by the white majority. They went, this is great, we can dance to this. And so you got the swing era, and it was fantastic music. And there were many, Count Basie, many others, really, really big black American, US American stars in that. But it was very much, like the whites came along and said, how we like that, we're going to use that. So you got Glenn Miller too, and rock and roll came along. Rock and roll was originally derived from a kind of what's called urban blues, which is a high energy form of blues. It's not the acoustic blues of the Delta, it's the urban blues of Chicago, the northern cities, where it's much more strident, and much more. That developed into rock and roll, which is even more strident and is a pure dance music. But it's not, it doesn't have the same motifs as urban blues. Even Elvis Presley, who got a lot of stick for his dance moves, which were absolutely borrowed from US black Americans and their dance moves, he was still white, so he was acceptable. And that's what happened, because there wasn't freedom. Until the civil rights movement of the 60s, there really wasn't freedom. During that time, a language, a dialect really, but a dialect and a language is just the possession of an army, as somebody said. This language developed into a thing called Ebonics, and originally, Ebonics was something that, or this language which became Ebonics, was something that was spoken by US black Americans amongst each other. And when if there was a white person present, or anyone from any other culture, they would immediately drop back into a more standard form of English. It's comparable to me. If I was sitting here talking to one of my old friends from the town I come from in Scotland, you wouldn't understand a word we were saying. We would just drop into that dialect. And it's completely different. You wouldn't understand us. But I know you don't understand it, so I speak this, which is essentially Scots Standard English, just so that you can understand. It's called code shifting. Everybody does it, because getting the message across is so important. After about 1970, however, what happened was that US black Americans started to be much more confident about using their own dialect in the presence of others. And that's when you start to actually see and hear Ebonics. And Ebonics is actually, many people, comedians start to take, to use it for comedy, which was interesting. It's kind of the way Billy Connolly used Scots for comedy, It was kind of like, we're promoting our culture, but we're doing it in a way that won't threaten you. That slowly shifted. And in somewhere during the 1970s, a completely new culture evolved, which is called hip hop. Now, people often get confused here, but a black US American friend of mine, a long time ago, he explained it very succinctly for me. He said, look, it's really easy. Hip hop is the culture, rap is the music. And that's absolutely what it was. Rap was the musical expression of hip hop culture originally. I mean, you get other forms of rap now, and it's things like drill rap. And some of the things that it promotes are not very pretty, but originally it was all just about, this is what it's like to be a US black American. And alongside this idea of the music, other forms appeared too. Modes of dress, modes of ways of wearing your hair. In the 60s, US black Americans used to straighten their hair. If you see any early pictures of James Brown, he's got, James says, hair. He's got this hair that's all slicked down so that he'll look more white. And that was so they could fit in to this dominant culture. When hip hop came along, people were a lot less inclined to do that. And first of all, you got what were called the afros, which were these huge, like, Jimi Hendrix, like, loads and loads of soul bands had these huge hairdos. Lots of actresses had them. It was really a big thing. But what it was they were saying, no, we don't want to slick our hair down anymore. We're not wanting to do that. We want to be separate. And it's a cultural thing. It was an establishment of culture. And as that moved forward, other things came in, some of them from other non-African black cultures, like, for example, dreadlocks, started to be imported. Now, what is interesting is that it's really unique because of the history of slavery. But this creation of a new culture became very strongly defended by those within it. You know, Europeans don't care if you use our culture. We don't care. You know, if you want to dance around in a kilt, I'm not going to say a damn word. You know, if you want to have, you know, people who haven't been in Scotland in their lives, for the last 5 generations, by the way, want to have burn suppers, then I don't care. Recite burns all you like. I might laugh at the way that you do it and the strange way you pronounce it, but I'm not going to say, oh, you can't do that, it's cultural appropriation. Absolutely not. Europeans don't do that because we come from an established culture. We are the dominant culture in Europe. And in the Americas, we were. North America, anyway. Latin America, the dominant culture was also European, but it was not the same one. It's, you know, it comes from Spain and Portugal, so it's Latinate. Slightly different, but nevertheless, it's still dominant. So hip hop and its music, rap, became, you know, kind of like a badge of we are different and we're proud to be different. Which is fine. Nobody should criticize them for that. Interestingly, one of the things about rap, if you're a musician, you're listening to rap, the first thing you understand is that it doesn't really use melody. Used to be a form around called R&B, which really wasn't R&B at all, but it was like you'd have a few bars of a guy chanting rap, and then you'd get a chick singer going, you know, and they'd mix this two together, and it was supposed to make it more universally acceptable, which didn't really, but never mind. But, you know, just to aside for a moment, the idea of, you know, that spoken form is not actually an original black US American idea either. Remember that Shakespeare, the bard himself, Shakespeare is all written in iambic pentameter, which is a poetic form. Nobody on this planet speaks in iambic pentameter. Nobody. Right? And even though today when you hear some, you know, interpretations of Shakespeare, they kind of tone that down. When it was first done, it would have been recited. You know, in that way, that rhythm of iambic pentameter, which is pentameter means it's got 5 beats. You know, you're 5 beats in each line, basically. Iamb is a foot, pentameter 5, so it's 5, you know, 5 beats in each line. But no music. I mean, Shakespeare did use music, but not for his great soliloquies and things like that. They were all recited poetry, which is basically what rap is. Sometimes it's freeform, it's created on the spot, but essentially, rap is recited poetry, but without music, just like Shakespeare. And that became very critical to the new hip-hop movement, which appeared, well, it's not new now, it's 40 years old at least. But what has happened is that a lot of the motifs that were adopted by hip-hop as culture became, the US black Americans became possessive of them. They became territorial. I mean, it's things like you can't wear braids if you're not a US black American. Well, they're actually called Dutch braids, and they have been around for at least 1,000 years. We have images of, you know, Greeks, of Mesopotamians, obviously wearing braids. It's not a black thing at all. It's just been adopted. And once it's adopted by this culture, they are very defensive of it. The reason being, of course, that they're very defensive of the fact that they are actually black. I mean, there are, I think it's 40 million, maybe more, blacks in America, in the US America, not the rest. And they've always felt that this, because their own cultures were ripped away from them, stripped away, this is a very violent time and horrible experience for them. Imagine just having your entire culture removed from you forcibly, and you're obliged to adopt somebody else's. I mean, that's what actually happened. So you can't turn around and say, oh, it's awful that they do this. Of course it's not. They're just doing what anyone would do, which is to try to re-establish themselves as people and try to, in some way, express their lived experiences, within society in a way that people like them will understand. And they don't actually care if people outside that group don't understand them. I mean, why would they? It's the same as when they were talking Ebonics. I mean, I don't give a damn whether the whitey understands it or not. I don't care. What they're trying to do is establish something that is theirs. And of course, when you do that, then you take things like, braids is it's kind of a trite example because it's so obvious, but there are a whole bunch of things that, white popo are not supposed to do because it's cultural appropriation. And what all that means is that this black US American culture appropriated it first. And so it's like, no, we're here now. It's ours, can't touch it. Well, it's bull. It's absolute bull. No creative person should be constrained by this kind of nonsense. Absolutely not. I mean, I first became aware of this, I guess, about 10 years ago when people were criticising writers white writers who were trying to express what it might be like to be a black person in that culture. Trying to figure out what other people would do in certain circumstances is what a writer does. It's all about that. And the idea that you can limit people to one particular expression is ludicrous. It is actually ludicrous. It was ludicrous then, it's ludicrous now. But unfortunately that's, become quite a mainstream view. I mean, publishers actually employ people, well, they call them people, but I think they're a bit lower than that, called sensitivity readers. And so if you dare to say, the black guy did this, the black guy did that, whatever, and try to express what he might have felt like, or she might have felt like, no, can't have that. No, you've got to cut that. That's true. That is how it works. Sensitivity readers are essentially censors trying to change the way people think about the world. And they have absolutely no place at all in any creative milieu, and certainly not in publishing. No. Anyway, that's what I'm saying. So that's what cultural appropriation is. It's not the motifs that are being, appropriated, and don't actually belong to any single culture at all. They've been used all over the world for thousands of years. All of them. Things like, the chanted form of rap. Well, I just told you how Shakespeare did it. He wasn't the first. We know that a great deal of Greek plays, when they're put on, they were also chanted. Same thing. It's exactly the same thing. They were spoken with rhythm. And so you've got rhythm and meter. What you don't have is the melodic bit. The melodic bit was added in later. It appeared in Europe anyway. It's always there in European vernacular music, but we don't really have a record of that. But we know that in church music, when music was allowed back into the churches, because originally it wasn't. Christianity used to be like Islam. All forms of art were banned, and no singing. No singing. But when singing came back into, became permitted again, then forms developed like plain song. A plain song is basically a chant with a melody on top. And it's always the same. It takes 1, 2 or 3 lines repeated, and then a response line that resolves it. It's dead simple, but it is melodic. And rap is basically that without the melody. And sometimes rap, because of the lived experience of many US American blacks, excuse me, rap is often very angry, and it's therefore quite difficult for some people to get on with. I don't really like it because, being in the presence of angry men, anger is something I try and avoid and keep out of my life. But then you could look at bands who are old now, people like Salt and Pepper, who were women, and their form of rap was lovely, you know, because they were talking about a completely different experience, and one which you could listen to and say, hey, well, okay, fair enough. I get what you're on about here. And you're not being aggressive. I mean, they were aggressive, but in a very feminine way. Let's put it that way. And well worth reading and listening to, and many others of that type, you know. It's just that male rap has a tendency to be very, very aggressive. And that is, again, because of the nature of the way that US black Americans became US black Americans. I mean, they didn't volunteer. Their ancestors were happily being African in Africa, doing African things, until, you know, the king of Dahomey or whatever came along, sent his troops in, kidnapped them, sold them to Muslim slave traders, and they ended up in Alabama. I mean, how would you feel? I know I'd feel pretty shitty about it. I'd be angry. I'd be angry even now, you know. I mean, I feel anger about the Highland clearances. I'm not even a Highlander. You know, I'm a Lowland Scot, just so you know. And that's 200 years ago. So you can understand, I fully understand what's going on here. But what I am saying is that cultural appropriation is just not something that you can do. Or, you know, you can't claim. You can't claim that because someone does something or writes something or paints something, uses a particular form in its music, that's, oh God, that's cultural appropriation, you know. Can't do that. No, you can't have white guys playing reggae. Oh, no, that's not allowed. No, I can't have that. Oh. It's absolute bullshit. Of course you can. Absolutely you can. That's what culture does. And in a way, it's quite reasonable to suggest that a successful culture will be marked by how much it influences other cultures, which is to say, how much they borrow from it. You know, so you're not trying to keep, no, nobody else can touch this, that's ours. You're going, no, it's okay, this is a wonderful culture, you can share it. We don't mind. I think personally that those who promote this concept of cultural appropriation are actually doing great harm to their own culture. I know why they're doing it. They're doing it because they're feeling defensive, but I don't think it helps. I think where, as in the past, where black US American motifs were assimilated into the broader culture, then it was far more successful. You know, if you look back, well, rock and roll is a classic example, but you also got jazz, you got loads of other influences, and even in painting, people like Basquiat, using very African, very US black American imagery and motifs to produce something that would actually still fit inside a broader culture. To me, that's where it worked. That did work, that was successful. I happen to be a bit of a fan of Jean-Paul Basquiat, but that's not the point. He certainly wasn't the only one. So there you have it, cultural appropriation. You shouldn't do it. You shouldn't claim that it's being done, because it's a nonsense. If a white person wants to wear plaits or dreadlocks, I mean, I think they're horrible, but if somebody wants to do that, well, you know, tant pis. That just means that they've watched you and they admire your culture. It's a compliment, you know. Copying is often seen to be the highest form of compliment that can be given.